These are just a couple pointers or nuts and bolts about the non-dual awakening or the non-dual shift in perception that occurs in deeper realization. If you're interested in how to approach this, how to work on this, or when it comes in regard to what I usually talk about as Kensho or First Awakening, you can check out my playlist called Non-Duality. If you take a Feder approach or want to learn about the Feder approach, you can also check out my playlist called Feders with Kevin Shanelek, where we go through all of them, starting with 4 and 5. Or for non-duality specifically, you can check out Feder 6 and Feder 7. These are playlists that I have a lot of videos in. So there's a whole lot of pointing on this channel in terms of how to navigate that shift, how to trigger it, so to speak, or how to inquire into the illusions that seem to be in place that make it seem like you are fettered to duality, that you are bound to a life of separation, of disconnection, isolation, and so forth. So this video is a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of going through the process, how it appears, misconceptions about it, and some advice. So the first thing I want to say is that there are a handful of misconceptions, I think, that come up periodically, and I'm just going to address those in no particular order. The first misconception is simply a misunderstanding about the term non-duality. I've said this before, but I'll probably say it more because it's just one of those things that bears repeating if you haven't heard me say it. The term non-duality is used differently in different settings. There is a way of just talking about awakening videos or awakening as a topic broadly and just calling it non-duality, right? A lot of people will say watching non-duality videos, for instance. So it's almost like used as a term for what I would just call awakening or the awakening process. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just not how I use the term. I use the term for a specific shift or a specific insight. And again, that's clarified in my playlist that I already mentioned. So there's a more common online way of just saying non-duality as if it's this special form of awakening or something like that, or just a certain way of talking about it. Some people might even call it neo-advaita, that there's a group of people who speak a very particular way about non-duality. But I'm not talking about any of that. And I'm also not saying any of it's wrong. It's just a different use of the word. So I'm talking about a very specific shift. And again, I clarify that a lot in my other videos that are about practice. So that's the first thing I want to say that can be a misconception. The next thing I want to say is that you often will have tastes of non-duality in and with a first awakening. Not always, but often you may have experiences of unity or experiences of oneness or a kind of universal love that kind of cross over into an experience of non-duality, although it's often a very mixed experience, and there's a whole new experience online that has always been there but has become so prominent of consciousness, of the sort of oceanic nature of consciousness, or even the sense of I am, that you may not be able to pull apart what the non-dual aspect is versus the consciousness aspect versus the unity aspect versus the mind still trying to put it into some kind of container. So all of that, it tends to be happening at the same time, as well as resistance patterns still appearing here and there right after awakening. So it can be confusing. At the same time, I do see people who have often deeper awakenings. They will experience non-dual periodically, experientially. It will come and go. They taste it, but it's the subtlety of the realization is not there yet, so you don't really sense the difference necessarily. It's kind of mixed in with the whole soup. So I wanted to say that. And then the third misconception that I've pointed out many times, and I'll point it out many more, is that if you're trying to clarify non-dual realization, or let's say you're just trying to have a non-dual awakening, non-dual realization, experience boundlessness, experience formlessness, if you're trying to experience all of that and are not doing shadow work, that's not a great idea. It can lead to some bad situations, but most importantly, and usually it just makes you stuck. You'll have a conceptual sense of non-duality. You may understand some nuances of it. You may learn the doctrine. You may hear other people talk about it. You may even taste it periodically or have a kind of subtle or vague sense of it, but the realization is not clear. And so it's critical, even though these do not seem like the same space, shadow work and non-duality. In fact, sometimes we're hooked up in such a way that we're trying to use spirituality as a kind of avoidance mechanism of life, and we may think they're diametrically opposed. Like shadow work, all that stuff, that doesn't have anything to do with spirituality. Spirituality is seeing that none of that's true. There is no me. There's no one that's waking up. There's no one to do shadow work. Like you can actually start bypassing that way, which is exactly contradictory to what I'm saying. What I'm saying is most of the time I see if people are just kind of stuck or really having trouble discerning the deeper shadow stuff, the deeper non-dual insights, it's because there's shadow stuff that they're not seeing about themselves. It's just hidden. It's kind of hidden from them. So I can tell you so many stories about people I've worked with and watched wake up and stuff that even have told me very literally that when they heard me talking about shadow work early on, they didn't like it. Like they thought I was either wrong or it just didn't apply to them, or sure, other people need to do the shadow work, but I can kind of wake up and then somehow I'll be in control and can do it later or something. And it's just so misunderstood when you think about it that way. And then anyway, they tell me later on when the shadow work really hit, they were surprised. And of course, because there was so much resistance, it was very uncomfortable to go through. And yet on the other side, they started to actually have those deeper insights and then realized why I say this stuff, that there's a very, very intimate connection between shadow work and the deeper insights. When I interviewed Kevin Shanalek about the fetters, I think the 3 different videos, Fetter 6, Fetter 7, and Fetter 8, each one of them, he made a disclaimer at the beginning. He said, if you have trauma, make sure you address it, because as you break these fetters, one of the things fetters do is they keep your trauma hidden from you, or they keep it at bay, or they keep it contained, and you can't contain it anymore, so you have to deal with it. You'll deal with it sooner or later, but that's another way of saying what I'm saying. I kind of say it the opposite way. It's like, usually it's hard to break those fetters without doing the trauma work. You don't even realize why you're having so much trouble. So anyway, that's one of the misconceptions, is that non-duality can somehow bypass trauma work or shadow work or going to the deepest, darkest places. It won't. It's the opposite. They go hand in hand. So I just wanted to point that out. Another misconception is that, well, it's not a specific misconception. It's a way of misconceiving, and that is you hear people talk about certain things in certain ways, and then you look for it, which can in and of itself be a distraction. But beyond that, you can actually have that realization. You can have that insight, and because the way it's appearing to you is not the way it's appearing to someone else describing it, you actually question, like, is this it? Something definitely changed. Something changed, but I don't know if this is what they're talking about, right? A common one is that when you have, like if you, especially in the fetter approach, when the 6th fetter drops, you may have an experience of flatness, like the visual field appears very flat. And I think anyone can do this mental exercise. If you just look out into the world, or you just examine the visual sense, you'll see the depth, something being farther and closer and so forth, isn't in the raw data. For instance, if you take a newborn and it just sees what it sees, it doesn't have a perception that that's farther away, that's closer, that's farther away, that's an object, that's mom, that's dad. It doesn't have that yet. It learns it later. So when the 6th fetter falls, or when you have the subject-object experience collapse or dissolve, very often that is the experience, that everything's flat for a while. It can happen for a short period of time. It can happen for a little while, but it tends to just go away, or you stop noticing it that way. This is strange, but I think usually even when that happens, you can still notice that it is that way too. Like you can still perceive the visual field as this sort of flat array of colors and forms. That's all it really is. But it doesn't feel like the world is made that way to you anymore. right? And that tends to change with the next shift that occurs. But anyway, I just wanted to point that out, that I have seen people for whom the subject-object experience does dissolve clearly, but they don't necessarily notice flatness. Like that didn't happen with me at all. Although I can see it and perceive what people are talking about, probably because my eyes were crossed when I was a baby, and then they were corrected, but they were like overcorrected. So I never really developed parallax. I don't really have depth perception based on parallax. Like I can't see those three-dimensional things and stuff, the three-dimensional stereographs or whatever they are. So maybe that's why, but for me, it wasn't like that. It was basically just centerless formlessness. So yeah, sometimes we'll have this idea, oh, it's got to look like this. Everything's going to turn flat or whatever. And you don't have that. So you think the insight is not the same one, or you don't get what it is. But it is, and it's fine. That's not uncommon. So when the subject-object construct dissolves, it can dissolve with the experience of the world dissolving as well, form itself dissolving, perception, inner world, outer world, all of it just being completely obliterated. That can happen. That's more like what happened with me. Or they can happen in phases. So just be aware of that. And either one, it's fine. It doesn't matter. It's different for everyone. But when the subject-object experience drops and it's notable in that moment or right away, you may or may not have an experience of flatness in the visual field. You may or may not have an experience of total centerlessness. And you may or may not have some experience of formlessness. It may just be clear that the relational aspect of self and other is just a mental construct. It's just not here. Never has been, never could be. And that may be the long and short of what your insight is. And it can be a very simple insight, but it's very obvious that it's an insight. It's obvious that it's a direct insight, not a conceptual insight. So that's the subject-object experience dropping away. You may have, with that, there's going to be variation to how much of the sense of, it has to do with the centeredness, the being centered in your experience, but it's related to that, but it's not exactly the same. There's a variation in how much the sense of, I'll call it like self-importance, falls away. It doesn't mean you're going to stop eating or stop considering yourself a separate body in a conventional sense, such that you don't walk in front of cars and stuff like that. That's not what I mean. It's just the priority system in the mind starts to change with this quite a bit, to where it's hard to divide life into what matters and what doesn't matter. It kind of all matters in a way. And this can be quite an adjustment, because you start to feel this more universal compassion, a more universal empathy. Whereas before, maybe you didn't care about people in other countries who were starving, and all of a sudden you're like, damn, like I can feel that, like it's just different when the boundaries of me and mine being centered around you and the body and people who are close to you and so forth, it's just not there anymore. It's so spread out, and it's like so vast, that a bigger compassion can open up here, and a bigger experience of, I don't want to say responsibility necessarily, but interconnectedness. Interconnectedness sounds great, and there's an aspect of it that is great, this feeling of universal love, but there's another aspect of it when you are also interconnected with all the suffering out there that you can't ignore. So there's various degrees of that as well when the subject-object construct drops, and certainly as a result of that, over time there will be. Yeah, and the descriptions I hear in terms of that change in the visual field, and the visual field does seem to be the key to this, or an important key to this, vary a lot. So there could be, again, the flatness. There could be a sense of everything just gets a little bit hazy, and then it deepens until it's like clear that there are no boundaries, that the simple experience of boundaries themselves, like me, that, objects being bound and separate from one another, is just kind of gone all of a sudden, right? Boundlessness. That can be part of it. It will be part of it as an insight, but it can be part of the initial experience of like this sort of haziness in the visual field. And it looks like something's changing about your vision. Then you start to notice, oh, the boundaries that I didn't even notice, they're not here. Now they're definitely not here, right? There can be a sense of merging into the visual field, like not even the visual field, into the external world. So it can seem like objects are always at a distance, like that's over there and that's a little farther, this is a little closer and that's across the room. And all of a sudden you can feel like you've like lost the ability to make distance from everything, right? This is a different version, you could say, of the flatness of the visual field, but it's much more intimate, like, oh my God, I can't back out of anything. Everything is just like so close, like insanely close. That can happen, and that can be a bit of an adjustment. It can cause a kind of fear response sometimes, like you want to push away from it or back out of it, but you can't, right? And again, these are all sort of non-conceptual thoughts that trigger the fear. The non-conceptual thought is, oh, I'm stuck in this. I can't get out of it. I can't back out. But once you realize that's just a thought, just like the feeling of being apart from it in the first place was a thought, it'll all settle down. But you can have emotional responses, including fear responses. On occasion, I think this is a rare occasion, but on occasion, this will freak somebody out so bad that they'll start dissociating, right? The sense of intimacy is just so intense that they'll actually start trying to pull back from it. And then they'll do it in thoughts, like they kind of dissociate in thoughts. I find this happens in people who tend to dissociate anyway. And yeah, some people just have more propensity for it. But just know you can start trying to dissociate, which is really just pushing thoughts away. It's pushing thoughts away instead of going, okay, what are the thoughts? Like just being clear and inquiring into the thoughts that are the scary thoughts around the emotion, so that such that you see those are thoughts, right? That I'm going to be consumed by the environment, or I'm dying into it, or I'm dissolving into it, or I'm, whatever. It's going to be too much. It's overwhelming. I can't handle this. All those are thoughts. But if you're identified with the thoughts, meaning you don't see that they're thoughts, then you can actually start reacting to those thoughts and pushing them away and get dissociated. That's not what I recommend. I recommend just thinking, okay, what are the thoughts here? Feeling the intense emotions. Yes, it's intense. Fear is intense if it comes. Feeling it. And then what are the thoughts? Oh my God, the thoughts say I'm going to die. I'm going to dissolve. I'm going to, whatever the thoughts say, right? But seeing that they're thoughts is critical, especially if you tend to dissociate. Stay in the sensation, even if it's intense, and notice the thoughts. Just notice what they are. Just note them and you'll be disidentified. But you don't have to dissociate by pushing them away. Okay, so this is a not super common response or reaction to this, but it does happen for sure. So there's that. I think that's most of what I wanted to say, and I will give a couple pieces of sort of blanket advice at deeper stages of realization, and that is, one is, don't fight the process. You know that already by now, hopefully, but especially here, it's not a good idea to fight the process. It can be really not good. Number one. Number two, learn to ground yourself. Ground yourself in the physical sensations, somatic practices, movement, yoga, touching the ground, laying on the ground, feeling the body. Just get used to feeling the breath, reattuning your attention to the body, to the sensations, even as the sense of body starts to dissolve and intermix with everything around you. Stay with those sensations. The sensations will actually become more luminous. They'll become more prominent, even if the sense of a body is dissolving. It's paradoxical, but it's obvious in experience. And then it'll become an enjoyable experience instead of something that could be dysphoric when you're trying to avoid it all. Don't avoid it. Feel it. And be patient. Don't try to make conclusions about all this. They're just thoughts. There's nothing to conclude. This will take care of itself. It will settle. And lastly, be open to any emerging shadow stuff that's coming up. Feel it. Feel what's there. Feel it. Name it. Name the emotion if you need to. Understand what you're dealing with. Look into the thoughts around it. Realize they're just thoughts. Return to the body. Feel the body. Grounding exercises. Like sometimes you have to do a lot of this for a while because when you don't have boundaries anymore, the trauma stuff will come up if it's there. The shadow work will need to be done, and this is how you do it. And somatic practices and relational practices if you can find good resources. Trauma therapy can be helpful. Especially somebody who is, sort of an awakened therapist, which I know a couple. I try not to over book them by sending too many people their way, but that can be really helpful. Circling, extremely helpful in this space, like Inside Circle, TRE, PSIP. Yeah. Okay. I think that's it for now.